Wyre Borough Council decided recently that the seldom frequented museum at St Michael's on Wyre should be scaled back. It was suggested by the church committee that the expensive to maintain but generally worthless collection of fossils should be removed. When asked how he was supposed to accomplish this, the museum keeper was told that a by-election usually does the trick. Me and Jeannie McIntosh decided to visit Abistadama because we'd run out of places to film around the Wyre that didn't involve vertical mountains or were impossible to navigate for a nonagenarian on a Zimmer with a bottle of vodka. Abbeystead Dam, as it turned out, was only reachable by circuitous footpaths, so we parked the Scarlet P at Stoops Bridge and attempted to work out some potential routes on our Ramblers map. Abbeystead itself, which we visited back in episode 3, as I'm sure you can remember, a picturesque hamlet buried deep in Wyresdale, is owned, or so we're informed, by Arthur Mackenzie, the resident drunk at the Fisherman's Arms, by the extraordinarily rich Duke of Westminster, which might explain all the private property trespassers will be buggered notices everywhere, unaccompanied by signposted stiles. It's generally believed by local historians that during the 12th century there was a short-lived Cistercian abbey somewhere nearby, from which the hamlet takes its name. Possibly at the junction of Marshall Wyre and Tarnbrook Wyre, possibly at the north end of Abbeystead Reservoir. Nobody really knows, and nobody really cares. We followed one public right-of-way marked on our Ordnance Survey map into a bog so impenetrable that Jeannie McIntosh was pinioned in the mud for 30 minutes, and we had to extract her using wooden planks as crowbars. We tried the riverside route instead, which, after meeting a family of seasoned hikers on their way back, coated in mud so much that only their eyes were visible, we realised was just as impenetrable. At which point we gave up, because we've only got a limited number of years left, recycled a photograph of Abbeystead Dam that we'd found on Google Images for this film instead, climbed back in the Scarlet P and headed east into the mountains to the even more inconsequential hamlet of Tarnbrook, via the equally insubstantial smattering of stone cottages known as Lee, passing this extremely isolated Methodist church en route. Presumably at some point in history the locals had banished them. Lee is the sort of afterthought that only exists to fill up the empty squares on maps. However, it does have one claim to fame, or elitist obscurity, depending on your educational preference, that being its mention in the earliest known Robin Hood story, A Little Guest of Robin Hood, or at any rate Sir Richard of Lee in Wyresdale, whose son was in all sorts of trouble for murdering a Lancastrian knight, and who himself was drowning in debt to the unholy Prior of Lancaster, gets a mention. The story goes on a bit, to be honest, as did that last sentence, but Sir Richard apparently had a castle at Lee. We couldn't find it. We can only assume it was very small, possibly built out of Lego. Interestingly, or not, again depending on your preferences, according to the De Hutton Papers, a collection of documents dating from the medieval times, a certain Robin Hood murdered an also certain Sir Richard of Lee, circa the 15th century. Which crime doesn't happen in the narrative of A Little Guest, but who's counting? In fact, according to modern commercial mythology rather than historical legal documents, Sir Richard of Lee went on to become a regular guest star on the infamous BBC Robin of Sherwood black and white television series. It might have been ITV, we honestly couldn't be bothered looking it up. There's only one narrow, winding road leading from Lee to the village of Tarnbrook. Well, when I say road, it's just a single track, which, while picturesque, has no parking, so it's almost impossible to film. After following the Tarnbrook brook itself for some considerable distance, said track concludes in an isolated knot of old cottages and a depressed-looking farmyard. We abandoned the Scarlet P on somebody's front lawn so that we could take a proper look around and notice this gatepost, which by our reckoning, hasn't always been a gatepost. Study it closely and you might be able to make out some letters carved into its surface. We've no idea what they originally spelled, being them now worn down flatter than Jeannie Mackintosh's kneecaps, but the stone itself was either a massive medieval gravestone once, or an ancient roadside cross, possibly from the base that we mentioned earlier at Cross Hill. Didn't we mention the Cross Hill cross base? I thought we had. We're getting old, that's what it is. Anyhow, it stands at the end of somebody's drive, and come to think of it, it's a hell of a long way to drag such a sizable lump of stone, so it probably wasn't from there after all. There's a gate with a padlock on it, possibly belonging to the Duke of Westminster and his double-barrelled pheasant slaughtering mates. You can hear them out on the moors at times, gangs of aristocratic thugs sporting either too many gins or none at all. Said gate crosses the track leading up to the Tarnbrook Waterfall, preventing any vehicles, other than those laden with hoo-ha Henrys heading up to their hunting lodge, from progressing any further. We could see that it would obviously be a time-consuming, exhausting walk up the desolate fellside to our intended destination. We estimated approximately 46 miles, although the sub-zero temperatures caused by the wind might have impaired our calculations. So after a few uninteresting moments staring at the multicoloured tupping rams, we headed back to the Scarlet P, having decided to give the waterfall a miss after all. Fortunately, Google Images provided us with the relevant photograph. Having failed to achieve either of our original objectives for this film, our dilapidated jalopies spluttered back to Garsang, where we indulged in some cheese pie chips and gravy, and spent a pleasant few hours looking at the mouseboat-related paraphernalia, superbly priced and incredible value for the connoisseur of artistic memorabilia, at the Vintage Attic, down St Thomas's Weald. Ask for Sarah. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel. If you're already subscribed, then we can only apologise. Until the next episode, we'll be seeing you